Solzhenitsyn ended up more by doing a psychological analysis. And that's because as he considered what had happened to his country, he couldn't escape the proposition that the reason it had become so corrupt was because all of the individuals within it had allowed themselves to become corrupt. And so if you're wondering, for example, how you know your political system has become corrupt, or let's put it differently, how you know that any system that you happen to be embedded in has become corrupt, one way of assessing that, judging that, is to determine for yourself whether or not you're allowed to say what you think. You know, I mean, you can genuinely think something without it being right, obviously, but if you genuinely think something, that's your truth. And, you know, in the marketplace of free ideas, everyone is allowed to express their truth. That doesn't mean everyone's right. It doesn't mean that you have any right to have people listen to you. It doesn't grant you any access to power, but at least you get to say what you think. And if that's withheld from you or you're punished for it, you can bloody well be certain that the system has started to take a vicious turn towards oppression and repression, and that the outcome of that's going to be bad. Even if your thoughts are reprehensible, you should be allowed to put them forward, not least because the rest of the society needs to know where the dangerous wingnuts are, so that the ideas can be brought up, you know, out in the open and disqualified, you know. So freedom of speech encompasses the freedom to say the most outrageous things, just so everybody knows what you're thinking. Because if you can't say it, that doesn't mean you're not thinking it. It's just going to go underground and fester there like a Freudian repressed thought. So freedom of speech has nothing to do with protecting the kind of speech that is necessarily pro-social. It's exactly the opposite of that, is you want everybody to say what they're thinking because then you know what they're thinking. And it's also often the case that people can't come to the truth unless they're allowed to express their untruth and have that, you know, criticized in public forums. So Solzhenitsyn's conclusion was that there was no way that the terrors of the Soviet state could have got the foothold that they got unless individual people were willing to falsify the nature of their own experience. And in the Gulag Archipelago, he basically describes the society. It's 2,700 pages long, this book, and it's little tiny type. It's a very, very comprehensive examination. He basically shows you story after story, tells you story after story of how people falsified their experience in the service of the state. And so the story is basically something like this. He said, this is what happens when you give your God-given soul over to human dogma. So the basic idea is, well, you're left in a sphere that has the absence of a well-defined meaning. So that's a consequence of the collapse of the previous belief systems. And because you're torn apart by that in some sense, you don't know where to turn. And one direction is, of course, nihilistic, and the other direction perhaps is totalitarian. Now, another direction might be that you try to figure things out on your own and still live a life that's truthful and that has integrity. But we're going to leave that alone for a moment, because it's difficult to even conceptualize that might exist if you've already swallowed the presupposition that all the values have fallen apart. You turn to totalitarianism. Okay, well, it tells you what to think, it tells you how to act, it tells you how your society should be structured. But it does some things that are even more subtle and subtly destructive than that, because what it also does is posit a future utopia, which is an organization of the state where everyone has everything they want permanently. Now, Dostoevsky, when he wrote Notes from Underground, he basically said, well, this was way before the communist revolution. He said, he was talking about these sorts of utopian, egalitarian communitarians. He said they've got human beings completely wrong, right from the bottom up, because if you took the typical person, he says, if you gave them everything they possibly wanted to eat, so that all they had to ever do was eat delicious cakes, and they didn't have any other responsibilities than, what did he say, indulging in the continuation of the human species, And so that if they were so happy that if you put them underwater, nothing but bubbles of bliss would float up to the surface, the first thing that people who were put in that situation would do would be to wander around smashing things just so that something unexpected and interesting would happen. You know, it's a brilliant critique of utopianism because it's exactly right. Basically, Dostoevsky said, people are so crazy that they'd rather be subjected to inconvenient and unexpected occurrences than just to lay there all soporific with bliss. And so that there was something wrong with the whole utopian notion right from the get-go, because that's just not what people are like. They'd rather have interesting trouble than non-interesting perfection. You know, and I think that's an incredibly powerful idea. But anyways, you can just think about that in relationship to your own character. I mean, how often do you do something that's trouble just to see what happens? I mean, it's exactly what people are like, you know. Even chimpanzees, juvenile chimps, if they see an old male sleeping underneath the tree, they'll go and poke him with a stick just to see what happens. You know, and it's like, well, if you can't see humanity in that sort of behavior, there's something wrong with you. So, but the utopians offered this vision of the future, which was basically paradise on earth, but they also proposed that it was something that could be attained through certain types of, you know, direct political action, which usually meant, well, fix your neighbor up, or even worse, meant steal what he has because he shouldn't have it anyways. And the problem with the utopian vision essentially was that if my theory is associated with a future utopia in a logical way, so I can make a case to you that if you do this and we do that and they do this and we organize things this way, then we'll usher in a period of prosperity that's almost heavenly in its promise. The problem with that is it means we can do any bloody thing we want right now because the end product is so valuable that it justifies it. And so what happens is that the utopian vision turns into a rationale for the most destructive forms of behavior in the here and now. And then when someone's called to task for it, it's like, what the hell do you think you're doing? You know, they'll say something like, well, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. You know, and that's all well and good if you happen to be making the omelet, but it's not so damn good if you happen to be one of the eggs.